So let's move now to Leander. Yeah, Leander Gussman, who just completed his PhD in the University of Vienna. Leander works on the question of heritage management and transmission of cultural heritage, and he will present some of his PhD results.
Hi, good afternoon, actually, already. So I stand here with bad news. I think the abstract as it was presented is not fully developed. I was in the middle of my submitting my PhD, and then a lot of other things happened. So I will give you a rough framework. I will speak a bit about my PhD work, which has a key issue or limitation, which is that it is a central European model for quality assurance and quality management in European museums. So it's a collaborative stakeholder approach to how to manage values and quality in museums. So I was bothered by that limitation, which has mainly to do with access to sources and access to materials. So I thought, like, okay, I better embark into another project and try to locate my framework and my approach to working to a non-European context. And so I chose this case study of the Zanzibar Natural History Museum, where you will see later that I didn't get very far out of various difficulties, but I'm very happy to hear your methodological ideas and contributions on this. So I quickly run you through my my presentation, and then again I'm happy to receive input from you as I'm struggling with this adaptation. So basically my framework follows a very simple rule, which is a collaborative inclusive approach, which is sort of emphasized in this very simple nugget of nothing about us without us. I think this goes to museums, and this goes especially to the kind of communities that are connected to museums. Just very methodological, quick definitions. A museum, an institution is a set of rules, basically. So I follow an economic approach to what institutions are. This, you don't have to bother with this right now, but just to understand what, when I say institution, this is kind of technically what I mean. Then this, of course, begs the question, what is a social rule or what is a rule? And then I follow this definition, which is a framework. So then the definition of the museum comes from, this is obvious in this context here, ICOM. This is the 1946 definition of ICOM, which you might be familiar with. It's mainly collection-based. So as ICOM started, it was a very collection-based understanding of what a museum is. And since 46, something changed, and the idea and the concept or the norms around museum changed. And most of you are probably also familiar here with the 2022 edition of the definition of the museum, which emphasizes specifically, again, that it is an institution. And I already said what I meant with this. And that has some interesting additions in the 22 edition. It's participation of communities. And I'm always curious, so how do you actually manage this? How do you run a museum with the active participation of communities? And now, in my opinion, many museums find the somewhat boring answer and say, like, okay, now let's do a local exhibition and include, I make an example, out there's a bunch of skateboarders, they skate here every day, and then we invite them in and they somehow make some sort of intervention or something inside the museum, and this is usually sort of based on the content level of the community. The museum bring in the various communities. I prefer thinking about it on a governance level. How do you bring in the communities on a governance level of the museum? How do you make the communities that are connected to the museums participate in the governance and the structural, let's say, organization of the museum? And this is a fairly difficult question because most museums are state organizations or private organizations. You cannot just suddenly have a huge board or something like this, although some organizations try. Well, so this is, I think, an interesting question that comes up with this definition of the 2022 ICOM museum concept. And this is, so to say, the key hub or angle that my work and my interest on quality management and quality assurance focuses, because I think quality assurance and quality management is one way to include communities actively in the governance of museums. Also, this is just a very formal way of what I understand the different kind of stakeholders or communities are. It's a systematic definition. And now the question is, like, how do you bring all these people, how do you bring all these community into the governance of the museum? Now, in the former session, this has already been mentioned on the term the commons. So one way to conceptualize the institution, of course, is through the idea or the concept of a common resource. And here I'm following Ostrom's framework, mainly of understanding how common resources can be, I'm careful now with the word, well, collaboratively governed, let's call it like this. And also, too much, but it's a pretty nice idea. She won the Nobel Prize in economics for this, as I think a few years ago. And yeah, so what I think museums hold is common knowledge, or let's say a resource, like museums hold knowledge as a common resource. And the question is, how do you distribute this? How do you govern it? Ostrom has a specific type of framework for it, which I will also not go into too much details because it's fairly complicated. Also, this is just overwhelming, so don't necessarily read, but here is a kind of application to how museums can be understood as a common resource. And so all of this you might want to read about in my PhD thesis, but not right now. So a key concept in the PhD thesis, I graduated in the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna, and they run a program called Critical Studies Master. So critique is a very central mode of engaging with institutions. So I developed a kind of critique system or critique mode that I find important or necessary to approach museums. And it has mainly to do with informal and formal accountability of institutions. And yeah, so this is a little bit of the framework again. So again, I'm trying to make it very simple as before, nothing about us without us. Now, what am I critiquing? What I do here is, or what I try to do is a critique of domination and injustice. Very simple. Most institutions are, let's say, power structures. When you have power structures and hierarchies, which are inherently not bad, you usually need it to organize institutions. Just we don't want the kind of power structures or institutions that cause domination. So the focus is on a critique of domination and a critique of injustice. These things usually appear together, but not necessarily. So this is a little bit what the functionality of that framework goes through. Here we have an example of informal critique of injustice and domination, what we now call cancel culture. It's, so to say, an unorganized, informal way of holding individuals, institutions accountable. It has various kind of negative effects. So I'm trying to make an argument, for example, against cancel culture because it's not formal enough, I would say. Another thing we encounter in museums, of course, is museum activism, which is, let's say, similar than cancel culture, also something that comes out of the community. It's usually a bit more formal. Sometimes they are organized in NGOs or something like this. Here we have a very famous case in the art museum context of an organization called PAIN that successfully was able to remove the secular family which produced opioids out of several important institutions. So we have here a more formal way of organizing critique that comes from the community addressed toward museums and institutions. So already pretty good, but still rather informal. Here we have a pretty formal case of critique of institutions, which is a certificate, which is a certificate. This organization is called WAGE, and they hand out certifications to museums if they treat the artists, let's say, well, and pay them the money that they think is right. So they formalize this. They have a kind of a system around it. The institution can get certified. And I would say this is a positive, formal way of engaging in critique in, let's say, the institutional sphere of the museum. Think about this like the organic, I don't know what it's called in the UK, but in Austria, it's like you have the organic certification on your tomato. This is pretty much the same kind of thing. And this kind of certification is one tool in the context of quality assurance and quality management. Something that is not done, I would say, nationally, yes, in some countries, internationally or globally, the ICOM or the museum world hasn't found a way of, let's say, a somewhat unified system of quality assurance and quality management. Here we have a local case for the United States that does that quite successfully. And this is, again, the kind of model that I'm proposing for a European system of quality assurance that's certificate-based. So it's a very formal way, or some call it very bureaucratic way of making sure that certain values and standards are held up and that the institutions are accountable for these standards and values. So again, this is the European framework. Also don't necessarily bother too much around it. It's a specific governance framework, how that connects to museums. And it includes various types of stakeholders, and that is quite open. So this is just a systematic map. What specific stakeholders or communities are actually included depends on the specific kind of context. The important thing is that all the stakeholders come together. They find a consensus on what the values or the standards are. Then there is an accreditation body that is independent of those standard giving organization. And they check, this accreditation body checks with the museums if they sort of adhere to the standards. So it is a so-called tripartite system. So you have different kind of organizations independent of each other that create sort of quality assurance and quality management system, which sounds bad. It technically is also quite bad, but not in this case, I would argue, but also not too much to this. So this is pretty much the very quick and rough walkthrough of what I spent the last years researching and developing. Through a specific type of cultural studies approach. So this sounds very technical, but I went through it and in my research and looked at art history and said, okay, one of the key stakeholders in the museum are artists. So what kind of standards do artists have? Oh. And then I looked at institutional critique and sort of extracted the values and standards from the artist's perspective. I also did the same with film and popular culture, from Google reviews, from different kind of empirical sources. So now I'm gonna jump this part, which is sort of open government structures that were successfully implemented in Taiwan. So now then coming to the actual topic, which is I have very little time left, but now I'm trying to kind of like use this model and invert it or kind of bring it to the island of Zanzibar, which is actually an archipelago consisting of 2 islands, Pemba and Zanzibar, and try to understand sort of their current development. So Zanzibar, a semi-autonomous region in off the coast of Tanzania, had a relatively drastic collapse of their key historical museum, the House of Wonders, a couple of years back. And since then, which got a lot of attention, and so since then they are rebuilding and restructuring their museum landscape. They're also developing a lot of new tourism and get a lot of new capital in due to touristic development. So their museum landscape is currently changing a lot, and an interesting case for the redevelopment of museums. And here is the museum I'm talking about. It's a 200 square meter museum that was opened in 1930. It's the Natural History Museum of Zanzibar, installed by the British Protectorate. And now the typical question, let's say, that we would ask is like, interesting, how do we now decolonize this collection? How do we decolonize this presentation and mode of running a museum? Interestingly, this museum has just, so to say, officially reopened last week, 29th. This is a museum building from outside. It's an adjunct museum to a museum called the Peace Memorial Museum, which is just across the street. The official website is not up to date. I think it's somewhere, 10, 15 years old. So don't necessarily connect to this. So here we have the sort of the living heritage project that I wanted to like use as a case study, because, so to say, the government of Zanzibar connected with the UNESCO and several other countries or donors in this case went about to re-establish the heritage in Zanzibar, institutionalized by several museums, also the natural history museums, the Peace Museum, etc. So there's a big, let's say, redevelopment project. And this is now a social media image from just last week. Both of the museums that we just saw were reopened, here with the Vice Prime Minister. These are the official government, how do you call it, protocol notes for what to do. So something quite interesting is happening there. I started research. I collected all the news articles I could find. I connected social media posts. I collected a whole lot of material, which were somewhat inconclusive. The data I got from UNESCO was also not so helpful. I connected with some local researchers that went to the museum, but then were sent away by the guards and were not allowed to take photos. And I had to contact the ministry, from which I got no response. Then I tried to connect to the UNESCO directly and several other ways, all leading to about 10 or 15 emails, which amazingly got 0 response. I guess this is also now in the time of maybe 5 weeks or 6 weeks, so I probably have to be more patient. But so here I stand now. I think I have less than a minute left, but basically nothing about us without us calls back to me myself right now. I have the feeling I can say very little about this project without actually the stakeholders' direct empirical data, which I had hoped I would already be able to present today to you, and then give some sort of idea or apply my framework to their way of restructuring their current museums, which I don't know, or which I cannot do right now because I don't know what they actually did. I just know that they reopened like on the 29th of May, but I don't know the process of what kind of values they created, what sort of ethic codes they used, what kind of structural implementation of the stakeholders they had. So all of these kind of very critical empirical data on this case study, I don't have, so I cannot compare my framework to it. Well, I'm sorry about that, but I hope this will develop and I will be able to eventually get empirical data on the redevelopment and will be able to apply my framework to it and see how it works in a post-colonial, non-European context, and so to say navigates in such, let's say, more complicated terrain as it is in the European landscape. Okay, I think that's it. Once again, I apologize. This is a bit embarrassing, but that's just how it went. Thanks anyway for your attention. If you have questions about quality management or something like this in museums, I'm happy for conversations, debates, and so on. Thanks a lot. Also, if you have ideas how to approach Zanzibar specifically now in this case study, if there is so little empiric, I'm also happy to hear. Thanks a lot.